The wind howled as the battle cries filled the air. The Viking kingdom, once a thriving empire, now lay in ruins, its future uncertain. Erik stood at the top of the hill, his sword raised high, looking out over the remnants of his forces. His heart pounded in his chest as he thought of the betrayal that had brought him to this point. The kingdom that had been entrusted to his family for generations was now slipping through his fingers, and all because of one man's treachery. Erik had always believed in loyalty, in the strength of family, but now, standing on this battlefield, he saw how fragile those bonds truly were. The winds of change had come for them, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Erik had never felt so alone. As he walked through the ruins of his kingdom, memories of his father, the great king, flooded his mind. His father had ruled with strength and wisdom, but now, the legacy was shattered. Erik clenched his fists. His betrayal had been personal, cutting deeper than any wound. His brother, the one person he trusted above all others, had turned against him. The knife of treachery had been plunged into Erik's back by the one who should have been his ally. Yet, as the wind howled and the ruins of the kingdom whispered in the night, Erik knew this wasn't the end. He would rebuild, rise from the ashes, and make sure the name of his family would not be erased by a single act of betrayal. The winds carried whispers through the empty streets of the kingdom. Erik could hear them, faint voices of the fallen, calling his name. As the weight of betrayal pressed on his shoulders, he felt the anger rise within him. But he couldn't let it consume him. Not yet. There were plans to make, alliances to form, and enemies to confront. This was not the end, merely a new beginning. Erik looked out across the horizon, the path ahead uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure: he would not rest until his brother paid for his treachery. The kingdom may have fallen, but Erik was not defeated. Night fell, and Erik's thoughts became darker. The betrayal was more than just a personal attack, it was a threat to his legacy. The ruins of his kingdom felt like a reflection of his heart, shattered, lost, and cold. But he refused to let that defeat him. His father had been a king, a leader, and Erik would follow in those footsteps, despite everything that had been taken from him. He would reclaim his kingdom, not through war, but through wisdom and strategy. The night would pass, and the dawn would bring new hope. Erik spent the night in solitude, the weight of his thoughts pushing him deeper into the darkness of the kingdom's remains. But as dawn broke, so did his resolve. He would rebuild, not just the kingdom, but the trust that had been lost. The first step would be reclaiming the throne, and nothing would stop him. As the days passed, Erik's resolve hardened. The kingdom may have been in ruins, but Erik saw a spark of hope in the ashes. He knew that reclaiming his kingdom would take more than just a battle. It would require unity and strength beyond the sword. Erik sought counsel from his most trusted allies. The betrayal of his brother had fractured his family, but he would not let it break him. He had already begun forming alliances with other Viking clans who sought the same thing: revenge on those who had wronged them. They gathered in secret, in a dimly lit hall, far from the eyes of enemies, where Erik shared his plans. "We will take back what is ours," Erik said, his voice firm. "Not with brute force alone, but with cunning and wisdom. We will strike where they least expect it." Erik knew that the first step was to secure allies in the neighboring lands. Without them, his quest to reclaim the throne would fail before it began. He traveled through treacherous terrain, navigating hostile territories, and forging alliances with chieftains who shared his hunger for revenge. The journey was perilous, but Erik's determination was unwavering. He had come too far to turn back. In the cold winds of the northern forests, surrounded by towering pines, he met with an old ally, Bjorn, the leader of the Iceborne clan. Bjorn was a man of few words, but his loyalty was unmatched. Erik knew that if he could win Bjorn's support, the battle ahead would become much more winnable. "What do you offer in return for my support?" Bjorn asked, his voice low and gruff. The alliance with Bjorn was forged, but Erik knew that they needed more men. As they traveled through the harsh landscape, they passed through villages where the scent of burning wood filled the air. The people were oppressed, their spirits broken by the weight of the conquerors who had taken control of their land. Erik could see the hunger for rebellion in their eyes. He approached the village leaders, offering them a choice: join him in taking back their land, or remain under the thumb of those who had betrayed them. One by one, they agreed to join Erik's cause. Erik had built an army of outcasts, warriors, and farmers, men and women who had lost everything. Together, they would strike at the heart of the betrayal. With his new army in tow, Erik prepared for the first major strike against his brother's forces. They camped in the wilderness, each warrior sharpening their weapons, as Erik surveyed the land ahead. The time had come to make a move, and the stakes had never been higher. Erik walked to the edge of the camp, where the first light of dawn broke through the trees. He could feel the weight of his ancestors watching over him, urging him forward. His father had once ruled with honor, and now it was his turn to restore that honor. As the camp stirred to life, Erik rallied his forces, speaking of the justice they would deliver to those who had betrayed them. His voice was calm but powerful, stirring the hearts of all who listened. "This is our fight," he said, "and we will win, not for ourselves, but for the future of our people." The battle raged on the plains, and Erik led his forces with the fury of a man who had lost everything. The clash of steel rang in his ears as he fought alongside his soldiers, cutting down the enemies who had once been his family. But it wasn't just the physical battle that weighed on Erik's mind. The betrayal he had suffered, the loss of his brother, and the shattered legacy of his father, these thoughts churned in his heart, driving him to fight harder, to fight smarter. He wasn't just fighting for a throne. He was fighting for everything he had ever believed in. And in that moment, with the blood of his enemies staining the earth beneath him, Erik realized that this was not just about vengeance. It was about rebuilding what had been lost. The battle was far from over. With each victory came a new challenge. Erik knew that his enemies would regroup, and the struggle to reclaim the throne would only become more brutal. But his resolve had not faltered. The flame of revenge burned brighter with every passing day. He returned to his camp after the blood-soaked plains, standing in front of the remnants of the banners his brother had once proudly displayed. Now, those same banners hung in shame. Erik clenched his fists as he addressed his warriors. "We will not stop," Erik said. "Our enemies may have more men, but we have the will of the gods. We fight not just for revenge, but for the future of our people. We will reclaim the kingdom, no matter the cost." As Erik planned his next move, a new wave of enemy forces arrived, threatening to crush his army. The intelligence Erik had gathered revealed that his brother, now desperate to hold on to power, was bringing reinforcements from across the seas. Erik called for a war council, his allies gathered around him. The mood was somber, but the determination in their eyes was unshakable. His brother's army was strong, but Erik had no intention of surrendering. "We fight on our terms," Erik declared. "The enemy may have more men, but we have the element of surprise. We will strike fast, strike hard, and strike where they least expect it." The night before the battle, Erik stood alone, staring at the sky. The stars seemed distant, cold, as if they had turned their back on him. Yet, deep within him, a quiet voice urged him forward. He had lost so much, but the kingdom was within his grasp. In the silence of the night, Erik thought of his family, his father's legacy, the brother he once loved, and the people who had once trusted him. Betrayal had broken him, but now it was time to rise from the ashes. He took a deep breath and whispered to the wind, "I will bring justice, for all of us." The battle raged as Erik's forces clashed with his brother's reinforcements. The air was thick with the sounds of clashing steel and the cries of warriors. But Erik fought with a singular focus. He would not allow his brother to win. He led his forces through the chaos, his battle axe flashing in the sun. The tide of the battle shifted as Erik's strategy began to unfold, catching his enemies off guard. With each swing, Erik could feel the weight of his father's legacy pushing him forward. He shouted to his men, "For the kingdom! For our people!" His voice cut through the chaos, rallying his warriors to press on. As the battle drew to a close, Erik stood victorious. His brother's forces had been driven back, but the cost had been high. The battlefield was littered with the fallen, both friend and foe. Erik looked around, the weight of the victory heavy on his shoulders. This was not just a battle for the throne. It was a battle for the soul of the kingdom. The people had suffered, and they would continue to suffer if Erik did not win the ultimate prize. But as the sun set on the battlefield, Erik knew that the war was far from over. He had taken the first step toward reclaiming the kingdom, but there was still much to be done. In the days following the battle, Erik stood at the gates of the castle, staring at the kingdom he once ruled. His brother, now a fugitive, had disappeared into the mountains with what remained of his forces. The throne was empty, but Erik knew that taking it would not be easy. The kingdom was fractured, divided by old wounds and betrayals. But Erik was determined. He had come this far, and there would be no turning back. His warriors looked to him for leadership, and he would not disappoint them. The future of the kingdom depended on his next steps. "We will rebuild," Erik said, his voice steady. "Not just the kingdom, but the trust of our people. They will remember who stood for them." As Erik began to rebuild his forces, whispers of his brother's whereabouts reached him. Rumors spread through the countryside, each more fantastical than the last. But none of it mattered to Erik. What mattered was reuniting the people and creating a kingdom that would thrive once more. One evening, as Erik walked through the camp, he found a moment of solitude. He thought of his lost family, of his father's teachings, and the legacy he had inherited. The weight of it all was overwhelming, but Erik would carry it. He had no other choice. "I will not let the past define me," he whispered to himself. "The future is mine to shape." Word spread quickly across the kingdom that Erik had returned to claim the throne. But with it came resistance. His brother's loyalists, scattered across the land, began to rally together. They viewed Erik as a usurper, a man who had stolen their rightful king's crown. Erik knew that the true battle had only just begun. His warriors stood by him, but the kingdom was not yet united. The people still remembered the betrayals, and Erik would need to prove that he was worthy of their trust. As Erik looked over the new recruits, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. His actions would define the future of the kingdom. Erik met with his closest advisors in a dimly lit room, the air thick with tension. The map of the kingdom lay spread out before them, showing the division between Erik's forces and the loyalists. The kingdom's future would hinge on their next move, and Erik knew the stakes were high. "We strike before they can regroup," one advisor suggested. "The longer we wait, the stronger they become." But Erik, ever cautious, shook his head. "We must win their hearts first." The battle for the throne is not just on the field. It is in the hearts of the people. The day of the final confrontation arrived. Erik led his forces to the heart of the kingdom, where his brother's loyalists had gathered. The air was thick with anticipation, as Erik's army prepared for battle. The fields around them were quiet, as if holding its breath before the storm. Erik looked across the battlefield, knowing that this fight would determine the fate of the kingdom. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He could not allow his brother's treachery to define their legacy. With a final glance at his warriors, Erik shouted, "For the kingdom! For the people!" The battle began. The battle had ended, but the victory was bittersweet. Erik stood in the center of the battlefield, surrounded by the bodies of fallen soldiers, both his and his brothers. The sky above was still heavy with smoke from the conflict. Victory was his, but at what cost? His warriors, exhausted and wounded, began to regroup. The loyalists who had once pledged their allegiance to his brother now looked to him for guidance. The momentary silence felt like the calm before another storm. "Today we rebuild," Erik said, his voice steady despite the weight of the loss. "This kingdom is ours to shape. The betrayal is over. The future begins now." Erik knew that the physical battle was over, but the emotional war had just begun. As the kingdom began to heal, so did its people. Yet, not all wounds were visible. The loyalty of his subjects had been shattered by the years of infighting and betrayal. Trust would need to be earned, piece by piece. In the days that followed, Erik traveled from village to village, speaking to the people, hearing their grievances, and offering them hope for the future. The road to unity would be long, but Erik was determined to walk it. Together we will restore this kingdom to its former glory, Erik promised. In a quiet moment, Erik sat by a campfire, staring into the flames. His mind wandered back to the days before the war, before the betrayal. He thought of his family, his brother, the kingdom, the dreams they once shared. Those dreams now felt like distant memories. His advisor, a loyal friend who had stood by him through the darkest times, sat beside him. "You've won, Erik, but the war within you, that's not something the kingdom can fix." Erik sighed deeply. "I know," he replied. "But for now, I must lead. The kingdom needs me. The people need me." Erik returned to the castle, where the throne awaited him. The throne of his ancestors, now a symbol of not just power, but sacrifice. The journey he had traveled to get here was one of pain, betrayal, and loss. Yet the seat was his. As he sat on the throne for the first time, the weight of the kingdom's future bore down on him. It was not just about ruling. It was about restoring the faith of the people, healing old wounds, and ensuring that his brother's betrayal would not define their legacy. "Let this be the start of a new reign," Erik whispered to himself. For the people, for the kingdom. Erik's reign was not without its challenges. The kingdom, though united, was still fragile. Old enemies, both within and outside the borders, eyed the throne. But Erik was no longer the man he once was. The experiences of the past had forged him into a ruler, one who understood that power was not just wielded, it was earned. Erik spent his days reforming the kingdom's laws, strengthening its defenses, and ensuring that every voice was heard. The people slowly began to trust him again, and with that trust, Erik began to heal the wounds of the past. The journey had not been easy, but the kingdom was on the path to restoration. And Erik was ready to lead it into a new era. Erik stood in the war room, maps sprawled across the table before him. The kingdom was beginning to flourish once again, but not without its challenges. Outside forces, rival kingdoms, and even those within his own walls threatened the hard-won peace. The spies had brought news of an impending attack. An alliance of neighboring kingdoms, sensing Erik's weakness after the battles, saw this as their chance to reclaim their power. "We cannot afford to ignore them," Erik said, his voice cold. "Prepare the army. We will show them that the kingdom they once knew is no more." The room fell silent. His council members exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to question his decision. They had seen what Erik was capable of. The days leading up to the battle were filled with tension. Soldiers trained relentlessly, and Erik did not allow himself the luxury of rest. His mind was consumed with thoughts of his kingdom and the lives at stake. During one rare moment of respite, Erik visited the training grounds, where he watched his warriors prepare. The clang of swords echoed in the distance. His men were ready for battle, but he could sense the doubt in their eyes. They had fought many battles, but this would be the hardest. Erik approached his captain, a veteran of countless wars. "Do they fear me?" he asked, voice low. The captain hesitated before answering. "They do not fear you, my lord, but they fear what you will ask them to do." As the army prepared to march, Erik took a moment to reflect on the cost of war. His brother's betrayal had cost them all. And now, with this new threat looming, Erik was unsure if he could carry the weight of the kingdom's future. He stood alone in the courtyard, staring out at the horizon as the sounds of preparation echoed in the distance. He was not just a warrior, he was a king. And the crown was a heavy burden. A voice interrupted his thoughts. It was the young prince, the son of his late brother, who had now pledged his allegiance to Erik. "You'll lead us to victory, won't you?" the boy asked, eyes full of hope. Erik knelt down to the boy's level. "I will do everything in my power to protect this kingdom." The day of the battle arrived, and the tension was palpable. Erik led his troops into the fray, his sword raised high. The battlefield was chaotic, the sounds of clashing steel and the cries of warriors filling the air. But through it all, Erik fought with a single purpose: to protect his kingdom. His men followed him, drawn by his unwavering resolve. It was not just his skill as a warrior that inspired them. It was his ability to make them believe in the cause. As the enemy forces retreated, Erik's army stood victorious. But Erik knew that this victory was only temporary. The battle for the soul of his kingdom would never truly end. The battle was over, but the cost was high. Many brave soldiers had fallen, and the kingdom would bear the scars of war for years to come. Erik stood amidst the carnage, his sword now stained with blood, but his heart was heavy. The price of peace had been paid. As he walked through the battlefield, he could hear the wounded calling out for help, and the silence of the dead was deafening. His kingdom was safe, for now. But Erik knew that there would always be more battles to fight, more enemies to face, and more sacrifices to be made. Peace is never permanent, Erik whispered to himself. But I will fight for it as long as I can. The kingdom had been through much, and Erik now stood at the heart of it all, the very throne that had once been his father's, then his brother's, and now his. The weight of it all felt heavier than any sword he had ever carried. The council room, where once conspiracies had been hatched, now felt more like a sanctuary. His advisors sat before him, their faces etched with both respect and fear. The peace he had fought so hard to secure was fragile, but it was real. For now. We cannot rest yet, Erik said, his voice calm but determined. Our enemies may have been defeated, but the real challenge lies ahead: rebuilding, uniting, and holding our kingdom together. The advisors nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. Erik's eyes shifted to the large window, looking out onto the kingdom he had saved, but was yet to fully claim. Later that evening, Erik found himself alone in the castle's quiet gardens, lost in thought. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past weeks. The cool breeze that swept through the trees felt like a small blessing, something he had longed for during the heat of battle. As he walked the path, memories of his father came flooding back, his stern lessons, his quiet wisdom. Erik missed him more than he could admit. But he knew that his journey was far from over. He stopped by the old stone fountain, its water still and clear. He knelt beside it, running his fingers through the cool water, feeling the weight of the future resting on his shoulders. "It's all on me now," he whispered to the wind. The next morning, Erik was visited by the young prince who had been under his care since his brother's betrayal. The boy had grown, his face now showing signs of the man he would become. "My lord," the prince began, "I've been thinking. You've fought for this kingdom, for our future. But what of your own future?" Erik turned to face him, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean, your family, your legacy. Will there be a time when you can rest, knowing the kingdom is safe?" Erik paused. He had not thought of that. He had been so focused on protecting the kingdom that he had neglected his own happiness. "I don't know," Erik said quietly. "Perhaps rest is a luxury I will never know." As Erik continued his duties, the kingdom began to thrive once again. The farmers returned to their fields, the blacksmiths to their forges, and the merchants to the markets. People had begun to rebuild their lives, and the kingdom was healing. But Erik knew better than anyone that the scars of the past would never fully fade. One day, an unexpected visitor arrived, one of the old warriors who had fought beside Erik's father in the early days of the kingdom's rise. The man was old now, his hair graying and his face weathered by time. But his eyes still held the fire of the warrior he once was. "My lord," the old man said, bowing respectfully, "it is time for the next chapter of your kingdom." Erik met his gaze. "What do you mean? Your kingdom is strong now. But you must look beyond these walls. There are lands to the north that remain untamed. It is time for you to decide what kind of king you will be." As the days passed, Erik considered the old warrior's words. There were indeed lands beyond the kingdom's borders, untamed and wild, filled with untold riches but also danger. If he truly wanted to secure his legacy, he would have to venture beyond the familiar and face the unknown. But it wasn't just about conquest. It was about ensuring that his kingdom would continue to prosper long after he was gone. He had learned that peace was not something you could simply protect, it had to be nurtured. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Erik stood on the balcony of the castle, looking out at the vast lands that lay before him. "I will not rest until my people are safe," he vowed, his voice carrying into the night. "And I will ensure the future of this kingdom."